The 2020s are like the shittiest replay of the 1960s you could possibly imagine. It's like the worst rerun ever. Hey there once again, friends, fans, and foes of Dad Saves America. John Popola here, and this Friday I wanted to circle back to an issue that affects all of us in different ways, and this week has affected us here at Dad Saves America. And that is the issue of free speech and censorship, especially as it pertains to platforms like this, like YouTube and Facebook and social media, but especially YouTube. So yesterday's episode of the podcast, let's just say got dinged. It's a conversation that I had with Cheryl Askren about her new book, Follow the Science. And a decent portion of the conversation is about her reporting and her perspective on the medical system and, let's just say, particular preventative interventions that we are offered and recommended. And this conversation was deemed medical misinformation and actually struck down. It was deleted from the back end of our YouTube account, and we were given a warning, which, as I understand it, is a half strike on the channel. So what does that mean for us and for you as loving viewers of Dad Saves America? It means that actually if we make the same mistake or pre-crime, again, we will actually not be able to publish videos for an entire week. So it's kind of a big deal considering this is what we do. So I thought I'd take this Friday to explore why that kind of thing continues to happen and how we should think about that and who is ultimately responsible for this. So the first thing is, it's pretty awesome that we can do this. And I'm not trying to kiss YouTube's rear end, but the fact of the matter is that I'm old enough to remember a time where only broadcasters could broadcast. As far as how we operate and how every YouTube channel operates, we have to work within the essential contract of what YouTube does and what YouTube allows. And in essentially a free market, in theory, that's okay. You know, if YouTube wants to censor us, it's not really censorship. It's just them making decisions about how to use their private property, which is their servers and their bandwidth. Now, this gets more complicated. So first, there's the problem of government coercion and threats to these platforms. These platforms and all of us are being harangued and harassed by politicians all the time. Like this.
We're going to have to figure out how we rein in our media environment so that you can't just spew disinformation and misinformation. It's one thing to have differing opinions, but it's another thing entirely to just say things that are false. No. You're a sitting congressperson. You take an oath to defend and protect the Constitution of the United States. You're violating that oath in this statement, AOC. She really likes to go off on this. And in fact, it's not clear at all that AOC, or any politician for that matter, but her in particular, has a particularly healthy relationship with what's true and false.
I think that there's a lot of people more concerned about being precisely, factually, and semantically correct than about being morally right.
But being factually correct is important.
It's absolutely important.
It's an oldie but a goodie. More important to be morally correct than factually right. Fundamentally, we are dealing with people who believe in the noble lie here. Very much so. It isn't really about misinformation, as in information that's wrong or false or factually inaccurate. It's about whether or not the information serves a particular agenda or public policy or the like. Here she is again haranguing Mark Zuckerberg about the way he manages Facebook.
So you won't take down lies or you will take down lies? I think it's just a pretty simple yes or no.
Congresswoman,
I'm not talking about spin. I'm talking about actual
yes, in most cases, in a democracy, okay. I believe that people should be able to see for themselves what politicians that they may or may not vote for
So
are
you
saying,
won't take
judge
them
their
down.
character for themselves.
So you won't take, you may flag that it's wrong, but you won't take it down.
Congresswoman, it depends on the context that it shows up. Organic post, ads.
Right. One more question.
You know, it takes a certain kind of magical power to make Mark Zuckerberg especially empathetic. No offense to Mark Zuckerberg. Maybe he's a wonderful guy. She's not alone, of course, and the question of lying or fraud or misinformation isn't the only justification used by our betters to, clamp down on our First Amendment rights.
There's no guarantee to free speech on misinformation or hate speech, and especially around our democracy.
Yes, there is, though. It's called the First Amendment. There is. There actually is protection against misinformation. There is a thing called fraud, but you can go on the internet and lie. You are allowed to do that. I wouldn't say it's morally correct, but you are allowed to do it. This isn't just rhetoric. This is being put into practice. And what's happened in California recently actually points to the ways that this is going to start getting pretty dangerous.
The latest conflict between Governor Gavin Newsom and Elon Musk, starting with this video Musk reposted on X.
I may not know the first thing about running the country, but remember,
the video uses an artificial intelligence voice cloning tool to mimic the voice of Vice President Kamala Harris, and for it to seem like she's saying things she did not actually say. In response, Governor Gavin Newsom tweeted Sunday night, "Manipulating a voice in an ad like this one should be illegal. I'll be signing a bill in a matter of weeks to make sure it is." Musk replied, "I checked with renowned world authority, and he said parody is legal in America."
The renowned world authority was a particular professor whose name I will not repeat. Oh, Elon, you're taking trolling to literally new heights. So, okay, the Newsom example here of tech censorship is slightly more complicated in the sense that it is going to be difficult to navigate what's true and false and what constitutes libel and fraud and misrepresentation due to AI. Except that this particular instance was clear parody, number one. Number two, how is this any different than doing a really effective impression? At what point does AI and good impersonations end up being the same thing? I mean, should Shane Gillis get thrown in prison because his Trump impression over audio sounds spot on if he says something that's offensive or insulting about the president? What we have been seeing over the past 5 years plus is that the censorship and the moderation decisions that are leading to things like yesterday's video getting flagged and pulled down and our channel being warned does appear to be the direct result of our leading politicians, both in office and out of office, simply threatening the platforms to act.
We do turn now to a story breaking overnight. Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg claims he was pressured by the White House to censor content related to COVID-19 during the pandemic. Aaron Kotsur joins us now with details. Aaron, good morning.
Good morning to you, Whit. For years, critics have taken aim at Facebook for silencing views that challenge the general consensus in the medical community, especially about the origin of COVID-19.
And just to be clear again, the framework that is being used for determining whether something is or isn't misinformation is the current, largely government-led consensus. So what is the active policy of the CDC and the World Health Organization and the like? And if you haven't had your trust in these institutions severely compromised by their behavior during the pandemic, frankly, I don't know how you maintain that kind of trust, because it isn't warranted. I'm not saying they never do anything right, but I'm saying they did enough obviously certifiably wrong that putting blind trust in them or turning them into the benchmark for what is and isn't misinformation is essentially the most anti-scientific thing you could possibly imagine. But of course, you don't even need to look to them for sources of misinformation, because we've got sources of misinformation at the highest levels of power on planet Earth.
President Biden was asked about misinformation online in the summer of 2021.
On COVID misinformation, what's your message to platforms like Facebook? They're killing people.
They're killing people. Facebook. Remember this? They're killing people.
I mean, look, the only pandemic we have is among the unvaccinated.
The only pandemic we have is among the unvaccinated. This is in 2021. The President of the United States. That was false. That was false. So why should we have these people be the arbiters of what's true and false? Now, I will say this, this is all a bunch of Democrats. The Democrats are not the only ones putting pressure on these platforms to behave in certain ways. Here's Senator Ted Cruz sort of weighing in a similar way.
Facebook and Twitter and Google have massive power. They have a monopoly on public discourse in the online arena. At the same time that big tech exercises massive power, it also enjoys massive corporate welfare through the effect of Section 230, a special immunity from liability that nobody else gets. Congress has given big tech, in effect, a subsidy while they become some of the wealthiest corporations on the face of the planet.
So there is an asymmetry in our party politics when it comes to this issue, because by and large, for the most part, Ted Cruz here, while putting pressure on the tech companies to change their behavior, he's mostly doing that on behalf of trying to prevent ideological censorship against his political allies, conservatives and Republicans and the like. So that's not the same thing as seeking to actively censor and squash speech. It's not. It's actually attempting to use government pressure to open speech. But the lever he's choosing would do the opposite. So Section 230, which creates a certain amount of immunity for publishers like YouTube and Facebook and all the rest of these platforms, if that is removed, and Ted knows this quite well because he's a lawyer himself, the real regulatory body here in America that we get rightfully mocked all around the world for will be unleashed upon all of us. And that is all of the lawyers who will suddenly decide that they can sue every platform for every crazy thing anybody says on the platform. And they won't need to sue the individuals because the individuals don't have any money. They will sue the big, rich platforms. Now, what do you think the platforms will do faced with a mountain of lawsuits as a result of the comments and videos and content that creators publish? If you think that we will end up with more free speech rights on these platforms in the aftermath of that, well, I think you got another thing coming. But of course, it does get even worse. Earlier this summer, former President Trump took us to not my favorite place when it comes to free speech himself.
I watched yesterday and the day before, they're burning our American flag. And I said, I know they say it's unconstitutional. Well, make it not unconstitutional. You burn our American flag, you should get immediately mandatory 1 year in jail.
How's that any better? 1 year in jail for burning the flag? What is this, 1968? I mean, the 2020s are like the shittiest replay of the 1960s you could possibly imagine. It's like the worst rerun ever. It's like watching a show on rerun on Nick at Night and realizing it wasn't even remotely as good as you remembered it. President Trump, this is a bad idea. Yes, patriotic Americans don't like the flag being burned. I don't like the flag being burned. But it is well-worn territory that it is within our constitutional rights to burn the flag. It is. It's kind of gross, but it's your right as an American to do it. Here's the thing. One of the number one defenses that all of these pro-censorship politicians like to say is that they're just making recommendations. It's just something to consider. It's about as much of a recommendation as the local mobster capo coming to your shop and saying, hey, that's a nice business you got here. It'd be a shame if something would have happened to it. Like, don't pay no attention to my guy over here, Mr. FTC. He's just sharpening up his knives, no problem. Like that's what's going on. Pay no attention to Tony behind me. He's got that baseball bat because he's getting ready for a game this afternoon. That's what this is. And we see it playing out right now with YouTube's parent company, Google, in real time.
Breaking news this hour, a federal judge has just ruled against Google in a massive antitrust lawsuit. That suit involves its core business, online searches. Brian, this is a big win for regulators, right? Because they have been trying to argue that there was a monopoly here at Google.
Really, this is a massive antitrust ruling that the judge in this case is turning onto the Sherman Act. This is basically an antitrust law that we've heard in the context of a big landmark case against Microsoft in 2001, now being used against Google here.
So look, there's a much broader conversation about what good or ill antitrust can or should or ever play, and whether or not these companies like Google deserve to be broken up. I'm far more skeptical of that, even though I will be the first to recognize that Google in particular has enormous market power. They have what's called network effects, right? In the advertising space, they dominate it, and that does, in the short run, pose challenges. But to pretend that the antitrust action isn't being used in a racketeering way to induce behavior changes on behalf of censorship for our political elite is to be blind to the facts. And one of the things that's happened, and it's interesting that this clip points to the Microsoft case, is that Silicon Valley actually did have a kind of libertarian ethos in the early days. It was on the whole other coast from the old school sort of corrupt halls of power that run basically along the Acela line of the Northeast, from Boston and MIT, Harvard, through New York finance down to DC, where they pass all their crooked laws. Way on the other side of the country were nerds in their garages coming up with cool stuff, not paying any attention to the politicians. And then things started to change. And I think this is a really important thing to understand about the dynamics going on when it comes to these platforms that we now all rely on. Is it didn't used to be this way. So I got to give a shout out to Nick Freitas, who did a great sort of expose of this. And I want to show a clip from it because I think it explains the history of what has happened going back to that Microsoft case through to today, and how it has transformed the nature of the political relationship between Silicon Valley and big tech and Washington, D.C. and the politicians that want to tell us all to shut up.
Well, let's start with Apple. It's the oldest of the big tech giants, which had almost zero federal lobbying presence in the 1990s. In fact, in 1998, the company had a grand total of 2 federal lobbyists and spent about $180,000.
2 lobbyists and 180 grand spent on lobbying the U.S. government. Apple Computer. That's 1998.
Amazon, founded in 1994, also paid practically no attention to Washington, D.C. More than a decade after the company was founded, Amazon was still spending less than $1 million a year on lobbying. Founded in 1998, Google stayed out of the game until 2006, having spent just $80,000 on federal lobbying in 2003.
Think about that, $80,000, Google in 2003. Now it's 20 years ago, but they were already skyrocketing.
That same year, Facebook was founded, but until 2009, the company didn't spend anything on federal lobbying efforts. No, it's only within the past decade that the big tech giants stepped up their lobbying efforts in a major way. So, why the big change?
And this is a really important point. And I think it's a point that speaks to, I think, a very profound difference between, honest progressives, well-intended sort of progressives who believe in a big government, regulatory power to counter corporate power, and those of us more like myself who think that big government power is the problem and that it is the corrupting force. But that is a question that you could ask empirically and see, well, is it the chicken or the egg? Which came first? And in this case, we've got a pretty good case study for which came first.
What triggered this massive expenditure in federal lobbying dollars by a bunch of companies that not so long ago couldn't have cared less? And that story starts in 1998, when the Department of Justice leveled a major antitrust lawsuit against Microsoft over its decision to bundle its web browser, Internet Explorer, with the Windows operating system. The antitrust lawsuit alleged that this decision was made to try to crush Microsoft's competitor, Netscape. The lawsuit ended up dragging on for 2 years and nearly ended up with Microsoft being broken up into two companies by a federal judge. Now, prior to the antitrust case, Microsoft had spent virtually nothing on federal lobbying and paid practically zero attention to what was going on in DC. But their dust up with federal regulators who were determined to break up the company changed all of that. So, why does big tech suddenly feel the need to hire armies of lobbyists and spend fortunes courting the favor of Washington, D.C.? Companies like Microsoft probably want to avoid a repeat of the 1990s antitrust lawsuit that nearly destroyed them, while other companies like Facebook, Apple, Amazon, and Google want to rewrite tech and internet laws in order to entrench themselves and to protect their position as the dominant social media giants.
I think it's a great video from Nick. I'll put a link into it below so you can check out the whole thing. But that is the actual timeline of events. These tech companies weren't in bed with Washington until Washington told them, hey, you're either at the table or you're on the menu. You will hear this phrase from time to time, and it is a fact. If you think you can escape these people, the eye of Sauron, focusing on you, if you have any amount of success, you got another thing coming. It'd be a shame if something were to happen to your little enterprise. And so what has happened? Where are we at right now? The kind of ironic thing, and I think this is part of the broader sort of political alignment or realignment that's taken place, that, you know, the Democratic Party has functionally become the party of corporate power and of college-educated, urban elites. That is what the party is. That is the party's base. And it shows in the way political giving now takes place from Silicon Valley to Washington, D.C.
All elections, certainly over the last couple of decades, you've seen a heavy, tech focus on the Democratic candidates. This one more than ever. I mean, you're looking at 98% of employees from tech company, or 98% of the money coming from tech employees going to Democratic candidates and groups this cycle.
98%. That was 2020. And that was from the employees themselves. So that's not just about sort of corporate machinations. That's also about the culture that's taking place inside those companies, which I do think is actually kind of a problem. Not kind of a problem. It's a problem. But this cycle, it is pretty lopsided. Take a look at that. Do you think it's a coincidence that Google tops the charts on giving to the current vice president as the company is under threat of being dismantled? I don't think so. And do you think it's a coincidence that YouTube is being extra cautious in one direction when it comes to moderating content? I don't think so. I think these things are deeply connected. I think they are actually causal. Now, what happens next and what has already happened makes this story more complicated. What happens is you become your foe here. So companies like Google and Microsoft and even my beloved Apple, as they start to tangle and have their seat at the table, they realize that, well, if you're going to write rules, you might as well write them in a way that favors us. So how does that favor us? How do more rules and restrictions favor large incumbents? Well, let's take that California AI regulation, for example. OpenAI, with billions and billions of dollars, is much better positioned to comply technically, legally, with whatever cockamamie regime Gavin Newsom enacts than a small startup comprised of a handful of people that doesn't have billions of dollars and an army of lawyers at the ready. The regulatory apparatus with its 1,000-page legislation and its army of lawyers ready to step into action favors the big guys, favors big corporations whose legal teams still amount to a rounding error in their revenues. That is why this relationship between the regulatory apparatus and the freer market is corrupting. This is why I believe that the progressive story about the role of government in checking corporate power gets it exactly backwards. Big regulatory government gives rise to monopolistic entrenched power. This is why, for example, the United States has historically had much greater turnover in our Fortune 100 than in Europe. We have historically let companies fail. Sears used to be the Walmart of its time. It's gone. So did Woolworths, the Amazon of its time. Gone. But Airbus and Fiat in France and Italy, while sucking and often going bankrupt, are still alive and kicking like the zombies they are. The more we empower government to muck with these things, the worse things will get. And we have to find a way, and gosh, I don't know how we're going to do it. I don't know how we are going to do it, to unwind this and to let these companies stand on their own 2 feet, live and die by creating value for us, including not shutting us down for no good reason under threat of being broken up by the FTC. Now, I thought I'd end this little exploration/tirade with a look at a speech that former President Barack Obama gave at this Cyber Policy Center at Stanford University, which is a hub for Silicon Valley. It is really the leading educational institution that's connected to the Valley and to big tech. It really gives you a microcosmic snapshot of where our technocratic elite wants to take us. And frankly, I think it's really creepy and should be alarming to us all.
Those of you in the tech community, soon to be in the tech community, not just its corporate leaders, but employees at every level, have to be part of the solution. The First Amendment is a check on the power of the state.
Correct.
It doesn't apply to private companies like Facebook or Twitter.
Unless the state twists their arm, and then it very much does apply.
Any more than it applies to editorial decisions made by the New York Times or Fox News. Any rules we come up with to govern the distribution of content on the internet will involve value judgments.
So right away, what are the rules? What are these rules we're going to come up with to govern speech on the internet? It is taken for granted that there will be a regime of rules to govern our speech. This is the vanguard of our elite.
None of us are perfectly objective.
That is true.
What we consider an unshakable truth today may prove to be totally wrong tomorrow. But that doesn't mean some things aren't truer than others.
Here we go. You following? Some things have more truthiness than other things, which are less truthy.
Tech platforms need to accept that they play a unique role in how we as a people and people around the world are consuming information, and that their decisions have an impact on every aspect of society.
He's not wrong about that.
With that power comes accountability.
Accountability to whom? Accountability to the state, or accountability to those of us who use and ultimately pay for the platforms? This accountability question is socialized under "we." There's a lot of "we" under the surface of Barack Obama's rhetoric, where the royal "we" is really the government. That's, whenever you hear kind of the embedded "we," it's the government.
And in democracies like ours, at least, the need for some democratic oversight.
This is profoundly false. And we've been told this man was a constitutional professor. But in specifically our democratic republic, the United States of America, we have a First Amendment that says the Congress shall pass no law which does anything of the sort. We, as in our democratic vote put into action by our government, don't get to set the rules for speech. We don't. It's what makes America great. It's what makes America special in a time when the UK has thrown people in jail for tweets and Facebook posts, and hate speech laws are sweeping the West.
We, the United States, are the last beacon of hope for freedom of expression. And Barack Obama seems to think otherwise, and that is a tragic and I think intentional position he's now occupying.
Now, the good news is that almost all the big tech platforms now acknowledge some responsibility for content on their platforms, and they're investing in large teams of people to monitor it.
Isn't that great? Isn't that the good news?
But while content moderation can limit the distribution of clearly dangerous content,
apparently like our interview with Cheryl,
it doesn't go far enough.
Doesn't go far enough. No.
But I also think decisions like this shouldn't be left solely to private interests. These decisions affect all of us. And just like every other industry that has a big impact in our society, that means these big platforms need to be subject to some level of public oversight and regulation. It is a chance for all of us to fight for truth.
To fight for truth. This is the claim. Is this the truth?
The only pandemic we have is among the unvaccinated.
Is that the truth? Is this the arbiter of truth? Whoever happens to be in the White House and his administration? That is what Barack Obama and those that want to undermine the First Amendment and use the force of the state, both through regulatory and other means, to make these platforms we use bend to their will and comply with their vision of the truth and what is or isn't misinformation want. And the reason this is so profoundly dangerous is pretty simple. We don't know what the truth is at any given moment. Obama was right about that. The truth needs to be pursued. And the way we pursue the truth is through discourse, through exploring the outer edges. The entire history of science and technological discovery is people realizing that something that they thought was false turned out to be true. This is the way real material progress actually happens. And it's also the way we avoid mass delusion. I want to give you 2 examples of mass delusion. Number 1, you get 100 people in a room together randomly in this country, and frankly around the world, and you ask them what has happened to poverty on planet Earth since 1980. Has it gone up or gone down? 80% of them, and as you're watching, 80% of you will think it's gone up. This is about as false can get. You can go back to the 90s and 40% of the planet is living in desperate poverty, desperate grinding, less than $2 a day poverty. That rate of poverty has fallen dramatically in the past couple decades to the point where it is below 9%. Now, I'm not saying the world is perfect. I'm not saying that you yourself might not be living a hard and challenging life. But the notion that global poverty has gone up instead of collapsing at the fastest rate anyone has ever seen before just goes to show you how much of a problem it is when the discourse isn't allowed to really flourish. The second one, which is even more obvious because it's even starting to get talked about, is if you ask people, are there too many humans on the planet? A similar number, and this is around the world, say yes. They've bought into this big lie from people like Paul Ehrlich that the planet faces overpopulation. This is false. The biggest threat we face is populations going down. This is actually how we go way off track. Trying to crush dissent, trying to solidify incorrect consensus in kind of amber and fossilize it to the benefit of a small group of powerful people will leave all of us and our futures in peril. And that's why this is such an important thing for us to grapple with and understand the causes and try to grapple with where we can go from here. But before we can understand what should be done right, we need to understand why and how we have gotten to this place that has gone so wrong. But what do you think? As you know, I jump into the comments. I love to see what you guys have to say. I try to respond to as many of them as I can. And in fact, as we close in on 200,000 subscribers here at Dad Saves America,
I would like to celebrate by attempting to do our first live stream next Friday, where I will be reading comments from this video and others, and hopefully interacting with you live in the chat. So we'll put the link to that live stream as it becomes available, and I hope to see some of you there, especially you, Richard. You're always a good critic of mine. You know, friends, fans, and foes. That's that's you there, buddy. Have a great weekend.